Hi, Cole. Hi, Francis. And hello, Mary.
Hello, Eileen.
We had another great day today. I think spring has come. I think it's going to maybe we'll have nice weather from here on in. I can only hope.
I'll just chime in. Eileen, it's nice to see you and everyone. I think it's almost 7:03. We wanted to get started on time here. And my name is Kathleen Hamill. I co-chair the sub-working group at MAPPA for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We work very closely with the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group, and we are very excited about sponsoring this evening's program with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So Eileen, grateful to you for being here and representing the Women's League for International Peace and Freedom. Grateful, of course, also to Mary Olson, our guest this evening, who will be our primary speaker, and to Fran Jeffries, who will be our moderator and our Q&A facilitator, and she will be the one to introduce Mary. What I would like to do now is just to say that we are, again, very grateful the opportunity we have here to think carefully about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and harmful exposure to ionizing radiation, which Mary will get into in her remarks, and the chance to reflect from a different angle on what action we can all take to try to address and not only take action, but to hopefully eliminate nuclear weapons in the long run, as we know that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons seeks that universal ratification by all countries in the world, so that we can eliminate these horrible weapons of war. So with that, I'll just say briefly that I would like to urge any and all of you who might be interested in joining our TPNW subgroup to join us in our goals, which include hosting events like this evening's, but also on a practical level, supporting state and federal bills here in Massachusetts, such as the Back from the Brink bill, the Nuclear Weapons and Climate Commission, the divestment bill, and others. We seek also to encourage constituents, legislators, staff members, others in the State House, and also in the federal Congress to take action and to see the urgency of eliminating nuclear weapons. And again, in terms of building public awareness, we are looking ahead towards the second meeting of the state's parties in November in New York City, 2023. And we're looking for activists and advocates to join us as members of civil society to engage in promoting and urging our own country to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the earliest possible opportunity. So thanks again to all of you for being here. Thanks to Cole, the Executive Director of Mass Peace Action, for joining us. And again, a warm welcome to everyone. All of you are great to be here this evening, and I would like to pass now the mic, I should say, to Elaine Kurkowski to say a few words about the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and perhaps a few words about her own personal perspectives on the threat that nuclear weapons pose to all of us. Thanks so much. Eileen?
Hi. Well, I must say, I thought I'm unmuted, but I still have this little image that says unmute. And by the way, it's a real pleasure to be here and for this important, and I think a very good educational event. And I really am glad that we were able to co-sponsor as part of WILF. I have been a member of MAPPA as well for years. But I spend most of my time with the Boston branch of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was founded in 1915 during World War I. WILF works at a lot of things. We've been trying to achieve through peaceful means, world disarmament, full rights for women, racial, economic, and environmental justice. It works to end all forms of violence and to establish those political, social, and psychological conditions which can assure peace, freedom, and justice for all. It has branches all over the US and the world, and since 1948, it has had special consultative status at the United Nations, and including the special yearly event, particularly on focus of women. Our Boston branch puts much energy into supporting the International Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I personally am often vigiling with Sue Mirsky and a couple of other people, Vet for Peace, and Andre Sheldon on Mondays. But first, just a little bit on a personal note. I was a nurse practitioner in occupational health for several years in Massachusetts. In one industry, my job was to do lab work and exams on scientists and other employees exposed to nucleotides and dangerous chemicals to make sure that they were not getting ill from their work with them. Pregnant employees were assigned to safer jobs, farther away from radiation and toxic chemicals. The occupational health and safety team in the health unit I was working in did well, really well for employees in this particular place. But that company was bought out and a new owner closed the health unit and downsized the OSHA team. Unfortunately, we're hearing too many stories like this now, but we're here now to learn, to speak up. Oh, I'm so sorry. I think it's our job to learn as much as we can and speak up for us and for, to take care of ourselves if we're exposed, but to help other people to do the same if they're not aware, and particularly women, since that's what the issue is today. There has been a lot of research on the effects of radiation on humans ever since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I am really glad that there's been more precise information coming out on women, and therefore I'm totally pleased and looking forward to Mary's presentation. Thank you.
Eileen, can I just say a word about reminders to those of you who are participating? If you do have questions, please do put them in the chat. And as we close our program out around 8 p.m., those of you who would like to stay and ask further questions, Mary has gracefully agreed to stay beyond the 8 o'clock mark. So please do feel free to stay. And also, we have a great poll that we'd love everybody to respond to. So if you could please take a minute now and then later in the program to engage in that method and others. So again, thank you, Eileen. Thank you. Thank you also to Fran. I'd like to turn now the mic over, Fran, to you to say a few remarks and introduce our guest and our speaker.
Thank you. Eileen, you could not have been a more perfect person to set this up, I'll tell you. No way to predict it. So about Mary, I'd say ask the question, insist on the data, ask more questions. Don't be surprised that you'll find assumptions that haven't been tested. Mary's curiosity, courage, and mediation skills were fostered early on and then tested through her education in ecology and evolutionary biology, organic chemistry, and liberal studies. Her own experience with radioactive contamination as a young woman working in a research lab has put her in a unique position to speak publicly on radiation policy from a health, safety, and humanitarian perspective. After the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in 2011, she decided to pursue questions about greater harm to girls and women from exposure to radiation. From a study of survivors of U.S. nuclear strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, compiled over 60 years, she learned that there is measurably greater harm from radiation to girls and women compared to boys and men. Her briefing paper on the subject has formed the basis of her core work ever since and has led to speaking engagements, but for our interests in particular, to influencing international policies and agreements, and we see that influence in the TPNW itself. She offers an opportunity to see closely the public health consequences and hopes to inspire you to do the same tonight. Mary, welcome to Massachusetts Peace Action. We accept your challenge to be inspired and to take action. Friends, founder of Gender and Radiation Impact Project, Mary Olson.
Thank you, Frances, very much. I admit that I kind of took a swerve on preparing this presentation. So we're going to do some history and then we're going to do some radiation. I just want to mention that many of you don't know me because I worked for Nuclear Information and Resource Service for 28 years from 1991 to 2019. But the final 20 years were here in the Southeast region of the United States. It's a very underserved area, and I chose to come and have a regional office of the national organization here. So I haven't been in the Northeast very much. So it's nice to meet you all here and have this opportunity. I'll just mention that my slides have abundant citations and links, and they will be posted on my website, and probably MAPA will post them as well. And yeah, part one is this whirlwind history of our nuclear armed society from my perspective, and part two reports on biological sex as a factor in radiation harm. Next. I recently spoke at the ICAN. ICAN is International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, meeting in Oslo, Norway, the Act on It Forum. I saw a friend for the first time in years. She is now a mom and part of the much younger team that is leading this campaign at this point. I happened to mention that my parents were ban the bomb activists, and so I am second generation to activism. My friend was so moved by this insight that it caused me to change up this presentation, to speak less as a scholar and instead tell a story I experienced much of myself. I was born in 1958, only 13 years after Trinity. Next slide. Our event ended with a rally outside Parliament to invite Norway, a member of NATO, to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I will be calling it TPNW, which is its name in short form. The treaty came into force in 2021 and puts nuclear weapons in the same status as chemical and biological weapons. Illegal. Next slide. So our history. Looking back, this is from the United States perspective. July 16, 1945, the first nuclear detonation was made in south central New Mexico by the US military and codenamed Trinity. To this day, the roughly 15,000 children, women, and men who lived within 50 miles of that test and were not evacuated have also not been acknowledged by our government as impacted people. And so began the atomic age. Next. This photo was taken only weeks later from the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. It is a mistake to say that this photo is of the bomb. This cloud is what was moments before: buildings, trees, homes, girls, boys, women, and men. Next. Nagasaki before and after atomic destruction on August 9th. The church is in all of the pictures. Today, this size of bomb would be considered a tactical or small weapon. More than 250,000 Japanese people died soon after these two nuclear attacks by our government. Most were civilians. Next slide. Only 2 months later, in October 1945, nations of the world gathered in San Francisco to create the United Nations. The UN Charter defines the structure of the organization, and from the preamble I read, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to affirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small." 3 years later, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted and remains the foundation and code for humanitarian work worldwide. My parents, devout humanists, promoted the UN at every turn. Next. In the 1950s, the Cold War raged as a nuclear arms race between the USA and the USSR, and that extended into the 60s and 70s. This map shows the test sites where more than 2,000 nuclear explosions have already occurred. Our planet is deeply contaminated. The biggest white circle is Nevada test site. This map does not show fallout. Next slide. But this one does. Richard Miller constructed this image using official data from the 100 above ground nuclear weapons tests in Nevada and weather data available at the time. Radioactivity is invisible. From this image, we can see we are all downwinders. Next slide. Art and social change. We use this word intersectionality. This is nuclear, environmental, and peace, which are all the same by some and not by others. Reynolds' song, "What Have They Done to the Rain?" was about radioactive rain that fell during nuclear weapons tests, hence fallout. War is not healthy for children and other living things, says it all. Today, we would say it went viral. Back then, it was t-shirts and posters. The artist was Lorraine Schneider. Both of these women were in my mother's extended network. Next slide. Stopping the detonation of nuclear weapons above ground, or really anywhere, was the goal of many, many people. The baby tooth study led by Louise Reese in St. Louis was a huge tool in that campaign. Strontium-90 is a fission product in fallout and mimics calcium in the body, so it deposits in teeth. Baby teeth are a simple way to collect samples. And, well, they are from babies and growing children. And the study showed everyone that fallout is in babies' bodies. My baby teeth were sent off in a little brown packet like everybody else and were part of convincing world leaders to stop above ground nuclear testing. The tooth study continues today, led by Joe Mangano and the Radiation Public Health Project. Next. Women's Strike for Peace grew out of a major demonstration against nuclear weapons in 1961, organized by women. More than 50,000 women marched in 60 cities in the United States to demonstrate against nuclear weapons under the slogan, "End the arms race, not the human race." My mom was packed and set to go to St. Louis, but the car broke down. Next slide. A huge victory to this day is the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty still in force. It is good to know that nuclear history has been messy before now. Leading up to the treaty in 1962, the US and the USSR were in a nuclear standoff known today as the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was only a year later in 1963 that they both adopted the Partial Test Ban Treaty, ending most atmospheric nuclear testing. Testing continued below ground in the USA until 1992. Now it is digital. Next slide. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, was opened for signing. The USA and the USSR both signed it promptly. Next slide. But my family missed it, or we would have celebrated. That year, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. In October in Chicago, peaceful anti-war protests turned violent. Next slide. But we did celebrate when it came into force in 1970, a banner year for hope. We also got the first full photo of Earth from space and the first Earth Day. Next slide. Now we jump to 2010, the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. It was a turning point. I was a speaker for my community and presented many beautiful slides to the General Assembly like this one. The collaborative paper focused on uranium as a common root of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. Uranium mining continues to poison the traditional lands of Native peoples worldwide. Before any corporation prospectors arrived, Indigenous people have known that radioactivity is a hazard to life. Uranium needs to be part of this treaty, maybe someday. The 2010 NPT review report is the turning point. It included a phrase about considering the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. This small bit of text launched the Humanitarian Initiative. 3 follow-on conferences were held in Norway, 2013, and Mexico and Austria in 2014. Next slide. So that structure I mentioned of the United Nations, there are 2 major bodies. The first is really the General Assembly, but I'm considering the UN Security Council on this slide first. All the permanent members, China, France, Russia, UK, and the United States, actually, I guess it's Great Britain, not UK, are the permanent members. Other members cycle in and other nations cycle on and off. Each permanent member has veto power. No one else has veto power. And the Security Council administers the military code, and up to recently, all of the nuclear accords and treaties have been under the Security Council. Whereas the General Assembly, each nation has 1 vote. Decisions are made by simple majority. The General Assembly administers the Humanitarian Code, and the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is under the Humanitarian Code and the General Assembly. Next slide. And it was born in 2017. This picture in the upper left is the treaty session president, Elaine White Gomez, celebrating as a General Assembly votes to accept the TPNW as written and open it for nations to sign. That fall, 2017, ICANN and Setsuko Thurlow got the Nobel Peace Prize for their work on TPNW, which is the first nuclear accord under humanitarian law. Aside from the color, do you see any difference between these images, which are representative, and those from earlier on? Next slide. Okay, now we're going to shift to the second part of our discussion. And Francis, could you give me a time check? How many minutes remain? Okay, I will proceed, figuring it's about 7. This is the cover slide from a talk I gave in 2014 at the conference on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons in Vienna, Austria, December of that year. And I'm going to talk about something that is a global consequence. We're used to thinking of global consequences as things like nuclear winter and nuclear famine, which are tremendously important pieces of the nuclear story. But the underreporting of radiation harm to half the world's population, and potentially through the generations, is also global in scope. Next slide. Radiation is invisible, but we can see the damage it has done to these chromosomes. Next slide. Radiation impacts our cells. When the reproductive cells are harmed, deformation is one outcome. This happens to all babies, plants, animals, humans. Reproduction is complex. On the whole, the most common outcome of radiation harm in this phase of our life cycle appears as various forms of infertility. Next slide. A clear spike in infant deaths followed the 1945 Trinity nuclear detonation. This finding was only recently reported by Tucker and Alvarez in 2019. Consequences of nuclear tests are tragic and often irreparable. Nuclear colonialism is responsible for disproportionate harm to indigenous peoples from nuclear weapons testing. New digital simulation of the French nuclear tests at the island of Marora by Sébastien Philippe and his team at Princeton reveals far greater impacts to a wider area than previously acknowledged. And we need this remapping for all the test areas in order to comply with the treaty on helping the people who were impacted. Next slide. Cancer is the most studied long-term consequence of non-lethal radiation exposure. When genetic material inside a living cell is damaged, sometimes our bodies can repair that damage. Otherwise, the abnormal cell may sit quietly in the body for years or even decades before it makes us sick. There is no way to predict which exposure will result in cancer. In general, more radiation equals more cancer risk. However, even an exposure too small to measure could sometimes result in cancer death. This is why cancer is studied in large populations that are impacted, and these are compared to a control or unexposed group. Next slide. Since children are growing, the cells in their bodies are dividing more rapidly. The DNA in cells is more likely to be damaged when in cell division. Next slide. I put in the cover of this very important report. It's called The Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation number 7. It's also called BEER 7, and is the source of the data for the findings I'm about to present. I did not collect the data myself. The data is primarily from the survivors of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I need to qualify the data a little bit. First, only first-generation survivors are in the data. Second, data collection began 5 years after the bombs in 1950, so immediate deaths are not included. And the data is only binary, male, female, and sex was assigned by the researchers. Using this data at all, in my view, is to participate in a war crime. I wish that history had never happened. As one woman, I apologize for the decisions of my government, our government, to use the first nuclear weapons on cities full of people. The only reason I use the study is that it contains news. News I think we need for our survival as a species and as a living planet. Next slide. So here comes the news. Briefly, the survivors were grouped by the age they were in 1945, and the groups were tracked over their lifetimes. Cancers and cancer deaths were counted. I've already said there's problems with the data, but broadly we can say that those who were 5 or younger in August 1945 had the most cancer at some point in their lives. The news is girls in this group were twice as likely to get cancer at some point than were boys. Radiation is harmful to the boys. For every male that grew up and got cancer, at some point in their lives, 2 females got cancer, 2 girls of the same age. The BEER 7 report is where these numbers are found. The report itself does not discuss gender as a risk factor for cancer. I published my findings in 2011, and they confirm independent findings by Dr. Arjun Makajani and his team published in 2006. Next slide. Gender was also a factor for those who were adults at the time of the bombings. Over their lifetime, women exposed as adults suffered more cancer than did men in the same age group. For every 2 men in these cohorts who died of cancer, 3 women died of cancer. And this has changed my behavior in the field. Next slide. Okay, so this is the same information on a chart, and it is a scenario. So when we have 100,000 survivors, which is roughly what the study group was, 100,000 people, it's possible to do some what if scenarios. And this one is, what if everyone got the same level of radiation exposure, so that we can look at age of exposure and outcomes and the role of biological sex more clearly. So the bottom shows the age that people were in 1945 when they were exposed to the pulse of gamma and neutron. This is just the big burst of radiation as the bombs were detonated. And each age cohort was tracked for 60 years. So each line is 60 years of data. The blue lines are male, the red lines are female. And it is easy to see that females suffered more cancer than males in every age group. And the difference is greatest when the exposure was in childhood. Next slide. The US EPA thinks that girls are a subpopulation. We are not. We are an inextricable link in the human life cycle. Next slide. The best way to protect those most harmed would be to pretend that everyone is a little girl and set regulations that protect her. I personally think she should be a frontline little girl in a uranium mining area, for instance. Right now, the regulators of the world mostly pretend that everyone is an adult male. The problem with that is, as I just showed you, adult males are the most radiation resistant part of the human life cycle. This has resulted in a global underreporting of radiation harm. It depends on the age, so we'll say by a factor of 2 to 7, depending on the scenario you're comparing. Next slide. So I'm not going to dwell here long, but this work opens more questions than it answers. The first and foremost is, why is biological sex a factor in radiation harm? The finding says it is, but it doesn't say why. We need institutions of excellence to ask these questions, like, what about internalized radioactivity from contaminated food, air, and water? What about biological sex as a factor in non-cancer outcomes? There are others than I've already mentioned. Cardiovascular, for one. And what can you do about it? So we need people to get their PhDs and MDs while answering those questions. All right, we're almost there. Next slide. I also spoke in Vienna in 2022, briefing the states parties of the TPNW, and I was asked to sum up with 3 points. These points are: ionizing radiation is harmful to living cells. Harm is greater when children are exposed compared to adults. Number 2, at any age, radiation is more harmful to females than to males. Young girls are the most harmed by radiation, measured as cancer across their lifetime. Radiation protection does not yet reflect this finding. Prior to the work reported here, it was presumed that radiation, like the weapons that make it, was indiscriminate. Not so. These points provide strong evidence for the jurisdiction of humanitarian law over fission, most especially nuclear weapons. And I'll just say here that humanitarian law looks traditionally at impacts to non-combatants, to children, to women, to elders, and through time. Nuclear weapons are so indiscriminate that it was hard to show this until these findings are on the table. Final slide. I always like to end with this because it's a picture of health. These women recently, at that time the picture was taken, stopped a nuclear waste dump from coming to their traditional lands. Radiation prevention is more than avoiding harm. It is a source of health and empowerment. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Mary. Very much. Friends, if you'll put the questions you may have in the chat, we'll direct those to Mary. And did we have results from the poll that you wanted to share?
Let's see. You see that?
Yes. So 90% understood that the nuclear weapons are still with us. 10% thought they were gone, but maybe not sure when. And then, Mary, you can see the information on the TPNW and being under the jurisdiction of the General Assembly rather than the Security Council. So I think that's a good lesson for us, and we can kind of keep that in mind as you respond to questions. And the first question is to ask if, oops, sorry. If the NAS has issued any further reports on the topic since 2006.
Good question. The biological effects of ionizing radiation is a series, and the report that I cite is number 7 in the series. There is discussion of starting in on number 8, but they have not, as far as I'm aware, put the panel together yet. These reports are done by panels of scholars and scientists. There has recently been an examination of the study of low levels of radiation exposure, and the NAS has written a paper on its recommendations for how to proceed with studying that. Apparently, there's quite a bit of money that was given to the Department of Energy, of all all organizations. They are the largest employer of radiation exposed workers in the world, so kind of bad to give them money to study their own activities. So we've been working on trying to convince Congress to reallocate it, or the NAS to recommend reallocation through a competitive grant process. Those institutions of excellence are very much more qualified than are any of the federal agencies to do such a study.
So tell some more stories here, and tell us if any of your research affected the creation of the TPNW.
Well, I need to just mention that, like my other stories, my decision to ask and answer the question about the impact of radiation was the result of being in a room full of people in person, and a woman asking me the question, was radiation more harmful to her body compared to a man? I so didn't know about this idea, 2009 timeframe, that I gave a reproductive answer. And she said, well, that wasn't her question. And it wasn't until 2011 that I realized, watching nuclear reactors explode in Japan, in Fukushima prefecture, that I needed to get that answer. And so I wrote the paper in 2011. I took it all around. It kind of sort of sat there. There wasn't a lot of activity on it. And in 2014, my phone rang, and it was Alexander Kement, the ambassador from Austria, inviting me to come speak in Vienna. And I said that your esteemed Ira Helfand should be the one to talk, or the esteemed Arjun Makajani should be the one to talk, or any number of other people. I didn't consider myself as working on nuclear weapons at that point. And he kept at it. I said no 4 times. The 5th time, he told me it was going to be a room full of 1,000 people and 125 nation state ambassadors. And even though I'd only have 10 minutes, it was going to be worth my trip. So I ended up opening that conference.
Wow.
And the reason I opened the conference, I think, is complicated. And I'm not able to tell you what Ambassador Kment was thinking. But compared to some of the other possible speakers, I am a woman and I am a citizen of the United States. And I opened the conference with an apology for my government's actions in 1945. And I think it did exactly what he hoped for. And again, I'm projecting. I don't know what he actually hoped for, but in the question and answer period, half the talk was on what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki medically, and half the talk was on gendered outcomes of the lifespan study. So when the question and answer period came, the first question came from the United States delegation. It wasn't a question. It was shouting and yelling for 20 minutes nonstop. And it couldn't have been a better demonstration to the world, which was assembled in that room, that there was little or no tolerance for discussing nuclear abolition. So I think that's, in some respects, the initial impact that my work had. But then I had intuitively figured out that if I only had 10 minutes to tell that whole story, that I needed pictures, I needed silhouettes, I needed to make essentially a cartoon, a comic book, if you will. And it was having that. You didn't have to read English. You did not have to do higher math. He could communicate, he being Ambassador Kment, could communicate to delegations from all over the world a fairly complicated idea that radiation was more harmful to girls and women compared to boys and men without having to explain anything. He just pointed to the pictures. And he told me this in 2016, right after the United Nations had voted to go into the negotiation of the language of the TPNW. We met up in Brussels. I was there for a big conference. He was working there for Austria at the EU. And I'm about to finish the story by saying I almost missed the chair and hit the floor when he said to me how important the paper was in being able to get the meetings. It's not that other people's work was less important at all, but everything had been said about nuclear. It was locked up. There was no air in the room. Nobody wanted to take a meeting on nuclear weapons, but he held up my pictures and it got him in the door.
Thank you. So what hypothesis is most brought up when thinking about why women are affected more than men by radiation? Any hypotheses?
The hypotheses for why female bodies are more harmed, the common ones are that maybe we have more reproductive tissue, which we do have, and it is considered hot, meaning it is more likely to be damaged by radiation's impact. And we need to test that. We need to find out if that hypothesis is correct. Other people say maybe it's the amount of fat tissue that females have compared to males. But the most promising that I have seen to date are two other ones that are less brought up, because most people don't know that little children have free stem cells circulating in their bodies. And indeed, adults do too, but fewer. And it turns out that female bodies, little girls, have more of them than little boys. And stem cells are a good mirror to the shape of my bar chart. They tend to fall off at puberty, which is when the difference between males and females begins to fall off in the chart. So there's that one. And another one that has really some merit, I think, is the rate of maturation. Girls, of course, mature more quickly than boys. And there's a lot of different mechanisms involved in that. So is there possibly harm that is created by exposure to that system?
Just out of curiosity, are there places where that research is going on, or are those just in discussion stage at this point?
Francis, I go around the world giving this talk, so hoping that somebody's going to shake down a funder and get their lab going and get graduate students and postdocs and actually start turning out a literature on these questions. We don't need just one study, we need a whole literature. And I'm partially retired. I never had a lab. I don't have an institution of excellence. I'm talking to all those wonderful institutions in the Northeast. Get at it. It's time. This is big. You know, intersectionality, women, nuclear, physiology. I mean, there's so many pieces here. And, you know, all I can say is that it could be exciting. It could be so important. It could be so important to things that are different than we've been talking about, like space exploration. Like, one of the problems with studying radiation on Earth is that someone put it there, right? There's naturally occurring radiation, but the stuff that I've been talking about, somebody put it there. And that means there's liability and blame. But in space, it's naturally occurring at much higher levels than on the planet. And we have a mission going to the moon of primarily women astronauts. They've been having to take radiation into account. So this could be the reason to get the grant money is space, right? And then you could still apply it to nuclear weapons and nuclear energy and uranium mining and all the other stuff. But, you know, liability is a problem. And really, it's held us back as a species in terms of being able to overcome these previous decisions. One of the things I really want people to get is that all of this was decisions that people made. And now we are making new decisions. And even in this nation, so great, so strong, so wealthy, we can make new decisions and we can find new reasons to make new decisions. So if we need to use space as a reason to test these hypotheses, go for it.
So the advent of 3D screening mammography seems to be a creature of the medical industrial complex. Modern sonograms are successful in screening, but less profit, more expensive nurses and medical personnel. The person asking the question is concerned about her daughters and asks if anyone else is concerned or should be.
Well, maybe people will chime in on that and can do so through the chat. And I invite it because I have a policy not to give medical recommendations. I am not a medical practitioner, so I will speak simply of my own experience. In my lifetime, we've gone from exposing photographic film to using digital targets for the ionizing radiation to hit. And there's been a reduction about, I think it's a factor of 10. I'm just going to say roughly a factor of 10. I would have to look it up. But it's sort of like the 1970s when we all started driving small cars to save oil. We didn't save oil. We just drove more. It was cheaper. Our cars were more efficient. We could go farther. And that's what's happening with these digital x-rays. The doctors are ordering even more of them all the time. And, if you need them, if you have disclosure, if you choose to have them, I have them from time to time because of all those things. I need them, it's been disclosed, and I choose to have them. Mammograms, I tend to have about every 3 years instead of every year. There is a history of breast cancer in my family, but not a roaring one. But I recently had that 3D thing, and I honestly think it's about 40 times more than a simple digital mammogram on the calculations I've done. Again, I'm only speaking for myself. If somebody comes up with a different number, I'd love to hear it. I am not a practitioner.
Thanks. So what is the research on radiation and the genetic effects passed on to fetuses and to children yet to be born?
There is beginning to be a larger library, a larger literature on in answering that question is the way I'm going to put that. Certainly, when a cell is a reproductive cell, it has the potential to either result in deformations for that pregnancy or depending on when in the pregnancy it occurs, it could also damage the ova that are formed while in the uterus of the grandmother. In this case, it's the mother of the child, but the ova are going to be the grandchildren someday if they choose to do that. And so if there's damage to the ova, or in the case of a male body, there's spermatogonia, then there could be damage to that third generation in a single event. So during pregnancy, truly, there are 3 generations present after a certain point in the development of the fetus. I have anecdotal tales of people I know who are 2nd and 3rd generation in families that survived from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they are having all manner of disorders and problems. Same with survivors of Chernobyl and Fukushima. Unlike the A-bomb survivors, the big nuclear reactor accidents did not result in an organized study. You have to subscribe people into a study and then find a control population. You have to have funding. There has to be a commitment on the part of the participants to stay in over time. It's a big deal. And it's part of why I characterize the A-bomb survivor studies as criminal, is that the United States military was an occupying force and they didn't give people a choice to be in that study, at least at various points. I'm probably overstating that a little bit, but there was definite situation where the power was unequal. So we have a limited ability to study at the epidemiological level. I think there needs to be a lot more recording of family stories than we have today.
Thank you. We know people in airplanes receive more radiation from cosmic rays. Has anyone looked at those effects as differences between men employees and women employees in the airline companies?
A wonderful opportunity to do a study, and I've been told that the unions associated with aviation are very interested. I am not qualified to do that level of work, and so again, institutions of excellence, step on up. Maybe you're retired too. Talk to your children and your grandchildren who are still at work in those wonderful institutions and suggest to them that this could be the cutting edge that they want to be part of. I can tell you anecdotally that my parents knew people in the very young insurance industry, and the actuarial work on pilots was why they were originally supposed to retire very young, was to deal with the fact that they had a much higher radiation exposure. No similar provisions were made for the crews, but the assumption was that there would be turnover compared to the more highly compensated pilot group. So there's been knowledge of that. And I just want to add that these days, with families separated far and wide and shuttling little children back and forth, it really makes me worry, because those exposures really are like 600 times higher than being on the ground. They may be short, but if you're doing it many times a year, that's not so good.
Okay. The comment here, and to which you may want to comment, the writer says, what I felt was exceptionally unforgivable was that Japanese doctors were not allowed to share with each other the new symptoms they were seeing with radiation sickness, because the U.S. repressing the consequences of the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Any comment on that from your experience?
Yes, part of the war crime, undoubtedly, and in a situation where newspapers were being closed. I mean, there's very many aspects of that history that we need to understand and be ashamed of. I want to just mention that there's a film called The Vow from Hiroshima, which is the story of Setsuko Thurlow and really the story of the TPNW through one woman's life. And it shares a little bit of that history. And then I also want to mention that doctors in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia during the post-Chernobyl period also had to change. They kind of had a code for words they would use instead of radiation and instead of exposure, because they too were being repressed and told that they couldn't find radiation as the diagnosis for their patients. And to some degree, the same thing has happened in Fukushima Prefecture, a little bit different, but 400 psychologists were deployed to tell families, particularly mothers, that there had been a radiation hazard, but it was over 2 years ago. And this was, 3 years after the big tsunami and meltdowns that came after the tsunami. The radiation hazard was over, and that the symptoms that their children were displaying were due to their mother's anxiety about radiation, not due to anything else. And so if their children were sick, it was because of the mother's anxiety. I think we have a word for that in our culture today. I think it's called gaslighting.
I can see the faces, and I think there are some words they'd like to say. Are there other questions, comments? I'd like to also invite you to do one more quick poll for us, if you could. And Mary, are there?
I want to tell another story.
All right, go right ahead.
So when I was like 3 and 4 years old, I have an older sister, and like any siblings, we had stupid conflicts over who got what toy, etc. And my mother, after a certain point, would tell us to put everything down and come to the kitchen and sit at the table. We were going to the United Nations to work out our conflicts. And we would be asked what country we wanted to represent and certain other questions to sort of de-escalate the conflict. Now, I really wish that my mother had been schooled in proper mediation, because I would have loved to be, walk through that whole thing at that age. But nonetheless, I was at the United Nations in my imagination at that wee age. So in, I think it was 1997 or 1998, another time that my phone rang, and who is it this time? Before Comment in 2014, this was, almost a decade earlier. Who is it but Hans Blix calling my home phone? And he wants me to come because someone told him that if the IAEA, who he was the director of at that time, wanted to speak to the non-government organizations at the United Nations, including, by the way, WILPF and Peace Action and many others, that he would have to bring a critic of nuclear energy with him. And all my years at Nuclear Information and Resource Service, I was working on radioactive waste policy, primarily waste generated by nuclear power reactors, which, by the way, have split a lot more atoms so far in the history of the world than nuclear weapons have, even with the 2000 tests. Reactors are 24/7 when they're operating. It's a lot more fission, and all of it is nuclear weapons materials, one way or another, so in the waste. So anyway, there's Hans Blix on the phone asking me to come be the critic on the panel at the library at the United Nations at a date and time certain. And because of my experience when I was 3 and 4 years old, I was absolutely incapable of saying no to Hans Blix. I had to say yes. I had to go to the UN. And that was the beginning of what has become a very long-term relationship with opportunities to be part of the educating and participating. I don't tend to get into negotiating at all. I go to share information. And that day in the Dog Commercial Library, I listened to their presentation, and I had thought I was going to leave the agricultural programs alone, but I didn't, because they were all mutated corn and wheat and really demonstrated the health consequences of radiation. And then I'll just finish this story by saying that I thought that energy efficiency, wind and solar were the real answers, but that we had a very complicated industrial society. So it'd be easier. I was just thinking on my feet, looking around the room, and I saw all these people from all over the world. And I said, it'd be easier to go to developing nations where they didn't already have such a dedicated infrastructure, do wind, solar, and efficient design there, and then pay those people to come as highly paid consultants to apply the knowledge here. And Hans Blix did not like that I got a standing ovation.
So I'm focusing back just on the TPNW. How will you continue to engage in the scientific research and advocacy that might contribute to the universal ratification and implementation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons?
Should we acknowledge that it is 8 o'clock? Because I would love for people to stay to hear my answer, but I honor time as well as I can. So,
yes. And those of you who joined us, Mary has agreed to continue answering questions, but if you need to leave, we'll get the recording available since you're registered, and but you're welcome to continue for a while. Thanks. Okay, back to whether or not.
So the TPNW, yes. In 1998, who could have thought, really, you know? I mean, I just am so amazed that the TPNW is in my lifetime, that it's so wonderful to have a hopeful reason to get out of bed. Now, I'm the first person to say that we need to expand it, and we need to improve it, and we need to strengthen it. However, we also need to support it. And so my biggest role at the moment is as a cheering section, and especially because I see younger people in their 40s. They don't have to be youth. 40s is younger than me, and they are taking leadership roles and brilliant strategy to move this whole process by engaging the current moment. You know, we have Ukraine and we have Russia making these threats, and it's our President Biden suggesting that it's as bad as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, we have a major treaty that remains one of the hallmarks of improving the world, the Partial Test Ban Treaty that came only a year after that very bad situation. So my goal is to continue educating people, to continue communicating that this is all about hope. It's all about uniting ourselves so that we can become more and more effective, and standing back and cheering on the younger people who are just brilliant. They are just making the next steps really very interesting and exciting. And they're focusing, as usual, on the money, criticizing the big banks that continue to invest in nuclear. But many of those banks also invest in coal and other fossil fuels and extractive technologies, industries. And so one of the goals right now is to bring together a climate nuclear intersection. And I think that my health message helps to provide a common ground there. Especially the people who are working on nuclear energy have the same concerns about radiation. It's a real cross cutter. And we have never really focused on the fact that coal and uranium are interlaced in the ground. And oftentimes they are extracted together. And when coal is the product that's being sold, they send the uranium with it, which is part of why coal is so radioactive. And when uranium is the product being sold, I hear from friends in the Lakota country that They just burn the coal off without making any electricity at all. So we're beginning to find the layers of interlacing to make common cause towards sustainability something that we can talk about in many different languages. And I'm just thrilled, absolutely thrilled to have seen this level of interconnectivity come about. Because in my years in Washington, it was you did this or you did that, all that binary stuff, right? So
we have one more question. How does radiation add to the biological effect of other pollutants? We have so many persistent toxins out there, and they must interact in some way.
I had a mentor, several in fact, but Dr. Judith Johnsrud talked about multiple exposures, and we know we have them all the time, medical, natural, fallout still persistent in the environment. If we live near mining or nuclear energy or nuclear weapons production, we have multiple exposures. Those exposures are additive. There is a study done by Dr. David Richardson in 2015, looking only at adult male workers, but comparing many, many small exposures over 30 years to the risk profile from the A-bomb survivors. The same. Small exposures are not safer than the single large exposure, whereas our regulators have for many years assumed that slow, low exposure would add up slower and lower. And that is now known to be a wrong idea. So additive, cumulative, kind of a little bit different, and then synergistic. And this question is about the synergy between toxics and radiation. And unfortunately, I can't point to anyone who's been able to tease all that out, but there certainly is a big, huge separation in the US federal agencies between those who work on toxic substances and those who work on radiation and nuclear. And we need to break that wall down. And one place where I propose people might consider putting some time is on the EPA Office of Child Health, because it only considers toxic exposures. It does not include radiation at all, which is over in a different part of the building where they consider little girls to be a subpopulation. I kid you not. I've been up and down that street with them. So it's a slow process, but it's all about relationship. And when we can approach something with a little bit of joy in our heart, which for me, the TPNW does that. I am just in utter amazement that all those black and white pictures of all those men signing those pieces of paper at big tables have been supplanted by incredible women's leadership and by younger people's leadership. This shift to color was accidental, but it's representative of a real change in my lifetime. And I am just in love with it. So when we can step forward to somebody without telling them they're wrong, but instead asking them to help with something that's exciting and new, I think it's possible that we can make change. And the other thing that's happening is the generational shift. There's a lot of people in these large institutions who weren't there 20 years ago, weren't there 10 years ago. My mother was a developmental psychologist, and she and I disagreed. I always thought if we could have a standing group of people, we'd start getting it right. And she said, "What do you mean?" And I was a child who must have been a megalomaniac, because I just said, cancel birth and death. Just have one group of people. We'll figure it out. But for her, and I now see her wisdom, the rising generations are absolutely essential, and we can support them. We can applaud them. We do not have to talk over them. We can listen to them, and we can let them know that we're here for them in any way they need us. And that is what I'm trying to do for the TPNW.
think I'm going to leave you with just that, but I don't want to end it without thanking Mary very much for this gift, and also thanking the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and Mass Peace Action for its support, and the TPNW subcommittee, and my colleagues Susan and Kathleen and Eileen and Cole. Mary, thank you again so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
No worries.
Thank you, Francis.